She came back from the restroom to find the bill already paid. No name, no note. Just a cleared receipt on the counter, and Frank behind the window looking at something on his screen. She stood in the middle of the hallway and looked around at 400 people who were not looking back at her. One of them had done something. She just didn't know which one. Or why. Caleb Morrow had been waking up at 5:45 every morning for 3 years. Not because of an alarm, but because that was the hour the apartment shifted from night quiet into something that required him to be present. He would lie still for a moment in the gray dark, listening to the radiator knock against the baseboard, and then he would get up and start the coffee. He made 2 cups every morning, set both on the table, stood there for a moment with his hand around one of them, looking at the other, and then poured the second one down the drain before Addie came out. He had been doing this for 3 years, and he had never once thought about stopping, which was either a coping mechanism or a form of loyalty, and he had never tried to figure out which. Breakfast was scrambled eggs on school day's oatmeal when the temperature dropped below 40, and the walk to the bus required something that would last. Adelaide Addie. Always Addie. She had corrected teachers about this since first grade was 8 years old, and packed her own backpack with the methodical efficiency of a child who had decided early that mornings ran better when everyone did their share. She was out the door by 7:15. Caleb dropped her at school and drove the 12 minutes to Mercy General, where he had worked as a maintenance technician for 4 years. He had a structural engineering degree from Ohio State and a career's worth of bridge and building projects behind him, and he had traded all of it for a gray uniform and a toolbox because the engineering firm had required 60-hour weeks, and Addie had been 5 and recently without a mother. And when those 2 facts were placed side by side, there had been exactly one conclusion available to him. His mother had called it throwing his life away. He had called it building something different. They had not resolved that disagreement, but they had both stopped bringing it up, which was its own kind of resolution. Wednesday was the day without after-school care, which meant Addie came to work with him. She had a chair in the corner of the 3rd-floor service corridor, a padded one that Sandra had dragged from a storage room 2 years ago, without being asked, without making a thing of it. Just dragged it out and left it there. And she would sit with her tote bag of books and colored pencils and occupy herself with the practiced self-sufficiency of a child who understood that her father was working and that being good at waiting was a form of helping. The nurses on the ward knew her by name. Sandra brought her juice boxes on the long afternoons, set them on the chair arm without interrupting whatever Addie was drawing, and moved on. Caleb kept the corridor door cracked on Wednesdays and glanced through it every 20 minutes, not out of worry exactly, but because some habits install themselves into the structure of a person and don't come out clean. It was on one of those Wednesday mornings in the first week of October that he pulled out his wallet at the 1st-floor vending machine, and a small folded piece of paper came out with the bills. He picked it up without looking at it, pressed it back into the inner compartment where it had lived for 3 years, and handed Addie her water. She had seen him do this before, take it out, put it back, and she had her mother's gift for knowing when a thing was not hers to ask about. Caleb had found the note in the pocket of Dana's winter coat when he was going through her things. A grocery list. Milk bread, the red apples Addie likes, dish soap, the pasta she'll actually eat. Dana had written it on the Thursday before she went into the hospital for the last time, before either of them knew that was what it was. He had read it once in the coat closet with the door closed, and he had not read it again. But he kept it. He kept it because putting it down felt like something he was not ready to name, and 3 years later, he still wasn't ready, and so it stayed where it was. He was heading back toward the storage corridor when he heard the voice at the billing window. The 1st floor of a hospital is not a private place, and the billing alcove sat just off the main hall, and the acoustics were indifferent to anyone's circumstances. He heard a woman ask the clerk to run the card again. He heard the clerk say the result was the same. He heard the woman say very quietly, not to anyone in particular, Not asking for help, just saying the true thing out loud, the way exhausted people sometimes do when they have stopped performing. I can't pay this bill. $380 was what remained. Addie was standing beside him. She looked up and said in her matter-of-fact way, "But that lady's scared." He looked at his daughter for a moment. Her face was open and certain the way it got when she had identified something adults were pretending not to see. He said, "Stand here," and handed her the water bottle and walked toward the ATM in the corner of the lobby. He went to Frank's window, not the window where the woman was standing, and said he needed to cover the balance on room 214. He laid the cash on the counter. Frank Delgado had worked this window for 22 years and had seen enough of human behavior to know the difference between something that needed questions and something that simply needed to be done. He processed the transaction printed, the receipt, pushed it across to Caleb and said quietly, "Room 214. The kid's doing okay." Caleb nodded, folded the receipt without reading it, and walked back to Addie. They took the elevator to the 3rd floor. He did not look back toward the billing window. When Addie asked on the way up whether the lady was going to be all right, he said yes, and she seemed to find that sufficient, and she went back to thinking about whatever she'd been thinking about before, which was probably the horse drawing she'd left unfinished on her chair. Nora Sutton had been in the bathroom for 4 minutes. Not to cry, she was past crying by then, 3 days into this particular stretch of impossible, just to stand somewhere, with a door between her and the rest of it, to breathe inside a closed space for 60 seconds without anyone needing anything from her. When she came back to the billing window, the clerk told her the balance had been taken care of. Nora stood very still in the middle of the corridor. She looked around at the ordinary foot traffic of a hospital morning. Nobody was watching her. Nobody was waiting to see her reaction. There was a small girl at the far end of the hallway, sitting in a padded chair with a sketchbook, who glanced up for 1 second and then looked back down at her drawing. Nora turned back to the window. "Who paid it?" Frank looked at her with the steady expression of a man who respects the privacy of what he doesn't technically have to disclose. "Good Samaritan," he said. "Didn't leave a name." She stood there for another moment, holding the cleared receipt, and the feeling that replaced the one she'd walked in with did not have a clean word in English, and she was too tired to look for one. Owen was 10 years old, and had come off his bicycle on the steep part of Aldridge Street, 2 blocks from home on Sunday evening, catching the curb wrong and going over the handlebars. He'd been wearing his helmet. Nora had made this non-negotiable since the day she bought the bike, and the helmet had done what it was designed to do. The ER had ruled out serious injury within 2 hours. The neurosurgeon had recommended 1 overnight observation period that extended to 3 nights due to imaging irregularities that turned out to be nothing, which is the particular cruelty of medicine. Everything can be fine, and it still costs the same as everything not being fine. Her insurance had a deductible she hadn't finished covering for the year, and a coverage ceiling that the imaging costs had pushed her uncomfortably close to. She had been alone in these calculations since her husband Richard died 14 months ago from a cardiac event that gave no warning. She was accustomed to being alone in the calculations. It did not get easier. It got more routine, which was a different thing entirely. Sandra came in to check Owen's vitals at 7 that evening and found Nora in the same chair she'd been in all day, looking at nothing specific. Sandra was not a woman who filled silence for its own sake. She did what she came to do, and she was almost out the door when Nora asked if she knew who had paid the bill. Sandra paused. She looked at Nora with the expression of a person deciding how much to say. "He works here," she said finally. "Maintenance. 3rd floor. He brings his daughter in on Wednesdays because he doesn't have childcare." She picked up the chart and left before Nora could ask more. Nora sat with this for a while. It was Tuesday. Tomorrow was Wednesday. She found him at the end of the 3rd floor service corridor at 10:15 the following morning. He was replacing a section of fluorescent fixture that had been buzzing for a week. His back was to her, His daughter was in the corner chair working on a drawing of what appeared to be a horse, and she looked up the moment Nora stepped off the elevator, the direct, unblinking assessment of a child who has no use for social preamble. "You're the lady from downstairs," she said. It was not a question. Caleb turned around. His expression moved through something like recognition, something like the alertness of a man who has just realized a situation is developing in a direction he didn't plan for, and then settled into the measured courtesy he used at work. Nora crossed the corridor and stood in front of him and said, "You paid my bill." Not a question. He looked at her for a beat and said, "Is there something I can help you with?" It was not a confirmation and not a denial, and she understood then that he was not going to make this easy for her, which made her want to cry in a way the original crisis had not. She had the cash in an envelope. She held it out. He looked at it without taking it. "You don't owe me anything," he said. She said she didn't feel right about it, that he didn't know her. And he said quietly, with the finality of a person who has already arrived at a settled position, "That doesn't change anything." She stood there, holding the envelope, her prepared argument useless, because it assumed a gap in his logic that didn't exist. His daughter had set down the drawing and was watching the exchange with patient attention. "Are you okay?" she asked Nora in the guileless tone of a child, asking what adults in the room would have known better than to ask. "You look like the people who sit by themselves in the hallway outside the patient rooms," Caleb said. "Addie." Addie said, "I'm just asking." Nora looked at this child and understood, in the way you understand things in hospitals, when your defenses are already compromised, that the question was fair, and the honest answer was no. She went back to Owen's room with the envelope still in her hand. In the hallway outside his door, she leaned against the wall and breathed, really breathed, deliberately for the first time in 4 days. Owen was watching television when she came in. He shifted sideways on the bed without looking away from the screen, making room for her, the way he had since he was small, and she sat beside him, and he leaned against her shoulder, and she put her arm around him and held on. Outside the window, the October light was going gold and flat across the hospital rooftops, and the room was warm, and he smelled like the cedar soap she packed in his bag every hospital stay, because it smelled like home. And she sat there with her son, leaning against her in the ordinary way he leaned, and she let herself be still. That was the first warm thing in 4 days. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed it until it was already happening. Derek Sutton knocked on the doorframe the following morning with a box of Owen's favorite candy and a remote-controlled car that had clearly cost more than the situation called for. He was Richard's older brother, and he was not a cruel man in any dramatic sense. He was a methodical man with a talent for identifying leverage and a long habit of calling it concern. He set the candy on the tray table and the car on the windowsill and said that he and Janet had talked that they thought Owen might benefit from some stability while Nora got back on her feet, and would she consider letting the boy stay with them for a few months just to take the pressure off. Owen was looking at the remote-controlled car with an expression that wanted to be excited and was waiting for permission to be. Nora said, "Derek." One word. He read it correctly and didn't push further that visit. But the message had been delivered, and they both knew it had been received. The letter from his attorney arrived 3 days later, slipped under the door while she was in the cafeteria. She read it standing in the hallway outside the elevator bank, then folded it and put it in her coat pocket, and went back to Owen's room and sat down. The letter was 8 pages long and carefully constructed. Its central argument was that a woman who could not cover a hospital balance without the financial intervention of an unidentified third party had demonstrated an instability that warranted a formal review of primary guardianship. There was a footnote referencing the transaction record, a $380 payment on her account, by an individual whose identity and relationship to Nora were unspecified. Derek's attorney wanted to know who that person was. Owen asked her if she wanted to try the remote control car. She said yes, and helped him set it up on the tray table, and watched him run it back and forth along the surface with the concentration of a boy who had been horizontal for 9 days and was very glad to be doing something with his hands. She kept her face arranged in the expression of a woman who was not calculating outcomes while simultaneously calculating outcomes. Sandra found her the next morning and told her quietly that someone had been asking questions about the man on the 3rd floor, his schedule, whether he had family, what his relationship to Nora was. The questions had gone to Frank first, then to main reception, then to building security. Nora thanked her. She waited until Owen was asleep that afternoon, and then she took out her phone and called Derek's attorney directly. She said clearly, without raising her voice, that the inquiries about hospital staff not connected to the dispute needed to stop immediately, and that if they did not stop, she would be providing the probate attorney a complete record of the asset transfers that had occurred in the 18 months before Richard died, a record she had maintained carefully and had not yet introduced into any proceeding. There was a pause on the other end. She said she hoped they could resolve this without further escalation, and that she was available to discuss reasonable visitation arrangements. Then she ended the call and set the phone face down on the bedside table and sat in the dark of Owen's room, listening to the monitors and the sound of her son sleeping. And she did not feel powerful or victorious or any of the things she might have expected to feel. She just felt tired in a way that went down to the bone, and underneath the tired, very faintly, like something seen from a long distance, the possibility that this might actually be over. Frank came up to the 3rd floor the following afternoon, while Caleb was patching a water-damaged section of drywall. He stood in the doorway and told him that whoever had been asking questions about him had apparently stopped. As of that morning, he didn't know why, Caleb smoothed the compound over the patch with a wide knife and didn't answer for a moment. Then he nodded once and Frank went back downstairs. Caleb kept working. He had a reasonable idea of why the questions had stopped, and the idea sat in his chest in a complicated way. Not uncomfortable exactly, but not simple. Either the way certain things feel when they are genuinely true, rather than convenient. It was Addie who arranged the dinner, the way children arrange things, not with planning, but with a complete absence of the hesitation that makes adults talk themselves out of the obvious. Caleb and Addie were in the cafeteria at 5:30 when Nora came through with Owen in a wheelchair, his first permitted trip off the 3rd floor. Owen's face lit up the way children's faces light up when they find other children in places populated mostly by adults. Addie pulled out the chair beside her. Owen looked at his mother. Nora looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Addie with the expression of a father who has learned that some situations have already been decided by the time he hears about them. The 4 of them ate together, and Owen and Addie argued about the aerodynamics of remote-controlled cars with the authority of 2 children for whom this was serious intellectual territory. And the adults sat on either side of them and said enough to be present, and not so much as to interrupt. And the cafeteria did what it did every evening, which was hold all its various kinds of people without asking anything of them. Caleb was putting his wallet away when the folded note slipped out and landed on the table between his tray and Nora's. He picked it up before it fully opened, creased it back the way it had come, and tucked it into his pocket. Nora had seen it, the handwriting, the soft curve of letters that weren't his. She didn't ask. She understood the shape of what she'd seen the way you understand the shape of something, without needing every detail. She understood why a man who carried a grocery list for 3 years might also stop at a billing window and then walk away without leaving a name. Not pity. Something older and more specific than pity. The knowledge of what it costs to stand in a difficult place without anyone helping, and the quiet decision when the opportunity presents itself to be the person who helps instead. Owen fell asleep in his wheelchair on the way back to the elevator. His head tipped sideways, the drawing Addie had given him folded in his lap. Caleb steadied the chair over the threshold without being asked. Nothing was said. There was nothing that needed saying. The meeting at Derek's attorney's office was on a Thursday morning. They had not planned to arrive at the same time, but they did, and they walked from the parking structure to the elevator and rode up to the 7th floor in silence that was not uncomfortable, and sat in the waiting area chairs that were too soft for waiting. At 10:12, the assistant led them into the conference room, where Derek sat with 2 attorneys and a printed binder, and where he looked at Caleb with an expression that made clear he had not expected a third person and was recalibrating accordingly. Derek's lead attorney opened the meeting and laid out the argument: financial instability, unverified support, the suitability of the current environment. He was partway through the second point when Caleb set a document on the table, 1 page notarized, printed on plain paper. The attorney stopped. Caleb did not raise his voice. He had the flatness of delivery that comes not from coldness, but from having thought carefully about what needs to be said and deciding to say only that. He said the document was a voluntary statement, confirming that the payment to Mercy General Billing had been made without solicitation, without any financial arrangement, and without any expectation of reciprocity. He said the identity of the person who made the payment was not relevant to the question of Nora Sutton's fitness as a parent, because the payment had no bearing on her financial capacity. It was a one-time act by an unrelated party, and no inference about dependency could reasonably be drawn from it. Then he said the thing he had not planned to say, the thing that came out with the particular steadiness of something a person has been thinking for a while. Without knowing, they were thinking it. A woman who is alone in a hospital at 3 in the morning and cannot cover an unexpected balance is not demonstrating an inability to provide for her child. She is demonstrating that she is doing it without help, which is a different thing entirely, and in his experience, the considerably harder one. He picked up his copy of the statement and sat back in his chair. Derek's lead attorney looked at the document. He looked at Derek. Derek had the expression of a man who had expected a room of 2 and found a room of 3, and who had the self-awareness to recognize when the math had changed. He said they would need to revisit some of the points. His attorney said they appreciated the clarity. The meeting ended at 10:38. In the hospital parking structure afterward, Nora stopped walking before she reached her car. She had held herself together for 11 days. Through the emergency room and the imaging and the 3 nights watching Owen sleep with monitors on his chest. Through the letter and the phone call and the meeting and all of it, she had held herself together the way she had learned to hold things together after Richard died. With both hands, with forward momentum, with the useful fiction that if she kept moving, there was no gap for anything to fall into. She had held it all the way through the conference room and the elevator and the walk across the parking structure. And then she stopped, and she stood between 2 parked cars in the gray concrete quiet, and she let it go. Not dramatically, not the way it happens in films, just the slow, silent release of a person who has been carrying something at full weight for a very long time and has finally found a place where it is safe to put it down. Her shoulders dropped. Her breath changed. She stood there for a moment that was not long in seconds, but was long in the way that matters, and then she straightened up and dried her face with the back of her hand and found her keys. Caleb was waiting near the elevator. He had not followed her. He had simply not left yet, which was a different thing. He looked at her when she came back into view, and he did the thing with his head, the slight forward tilt that asked without words whether she was all right. She looked at him for a moment. This man she had not known 11 days ago, who had stopped when no one else stopped, who had shown up in a conference room without being asked, who carried a grocery list in his wallet for 3 years and never explained it to anyone. She said, "You didn't have to come today." He said, "I know." She said she didn't know how to do any of this, meaning the thank you, meaning everything that came after the thank you. He said he didn't either. She believed him, which was what made it possible to stand there without needing to say anything else. Owen was released on a Friday morning when the maples along the hospital's east entrance were doing the particular red that only lasts about 4 days. Nora pushed his wheelchair through the main lobby with his discharge bag in her lap, and Owen directing their route with the authority of a boy who had spent 11 days being steered by other people. They came out into the low morning sun, and Owen tipped his face up toward it, with his eyes closed, just absorbing it the way you absorb things you've been temporarily without. Addie came around the corner of the building at a run, coat half-zipped, tote bag swinging. She said her father had dropped her early so she could say goodbye. She handed Owen a drawing, 4 figures in crayon, holding hands in a row against a yellow sun with no labels and no explanations. Owen studied it with the solemn attention children give to things made specifically for them. He said it was really good. Addie said she hoped his head felt better. He said it mostly did. She said mostly was probably fine. Caleb stood at the corner of the building, not coming closer, hands in the pockets of his jacket. Nora looked at him from across 30 feet of sidewalk. He did the slight forward tilt. She answered the same way. Then Addie reached up and took Owen's hand on one side. She looked at Nora. She held out her other hand, the one that wasn't holding anyone yet. Owen looked at his mother. Nora looked at the small hand in the morning light, and then at Caleb, who was watching from the corner with the expression of a man who has learned which moments are his and which are not, and who understood that this one belonged to his daughter and was glad to stand at the edge of it. Nora took Addie's hand. Nobody said anything. There was nothing that needed saying. Their car pulled up to the curb. Owen climbed in carefully, the drawing held flat in both hands so it wouldn't crease. Addie waved from the sidewalk. Caleb was already walking back toward the entrance, hands in his pockets, the same gray coveralls, the same ordinary Tuesday morning that was waiting for him on the 3rd floor. The doors slid open, and he went back inside, and the maples kept doing what they were doing, and the morning kept going, and Addie stood on the sidewalk a moment longer, watching the car pull away, before she turned and followed her father in.